Hi everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the Old World. Today we're talking about terrain and whether the release of Warhammer Old World would mark a good opportunity for Games Workshop to re-release some of its classic terrain ranges and maybe even something new. So, back in the day, Games Workshop did have quite an extensive offering of terrain/scenery. Woods, hills, buildings, fences, barricades, to name but a few. But the range now is much reduced. In fact, the most extensive range of terrain available with a fantasy sort of slant is for the Lord of the Rings range, though there's a few items available for Age of Sigmar too. From my brief look through the web store, they do tend to be quite specific items rather than being your generic terrain. And it would suggest that this therefore leaves a bit of a gap in their offering for their supporters, and particularly people who want to get into Warhammer the Old World. Now, Warhammer Fantasy Battle, that was played around houses, woods, swamps, hills. And I think Warhammer the Old World almost certainly is going to be using similar sort of terrain. And I'm not talking about the overly complex, like the more slims that they produce and things. Lovely terrain, but just your basic things that will block line of sight, will block marching routes, things like that. And this kind of brings us now into, I think, the concept of the hobby trumpet. Before I go any further, let's explain the hobby trumpet. So this is a concept that was mentioned actually in a episode of the painting phase a month or two ago, and it really could also be commented on as called the hobby cone. So at one end you've got the fat end of the cone, where someone who is new to wargaming comes into a store and they've got no experience, they've owned nothing, so they need everything if they want to get into wargaming. They need the models, they need the paints, they need the brushes, they need the glue, you name it, they will need to get it. And as they become more experienced, as they spend more time on their journey as a wargamer, they start to need less things. They're getting deeper into this cone. You don't need a tape measure, for example, because you've already got one. You don't need a painting tray, you've already got one. And as we get deeper into this cone, then our needs also start to become a little bit more specialised. We don't walk into a store and think, I want to paint my models green. There's a green, I'll buy it. We start to think around, well, actually, I don't really want to go to Games Workshop and buy the Citadel green because I quite like the coverage of this particular Vallejo green, or I want a bit more of a classic look when I'm painting the edges of my bases. So I'm going for the coat d'arms green, or whatever other range you fancy that's out there. You might be an experienced painter that's gone deep into the world of the airbrush. And actually, you don't want just a basic beginner airbrush anymore. You want one particular type of trigger. You want one that has particular types of controls for the pressure that you're firing the paint out at, to maximise the coverage in a way that works best for you. And as you get more specialist around your needs of your paints, of your tools, etc., then you're moving further and further away from where Games Workshop kind of sits within the coverage of the hobby cone. Where does it sit? Well, it's not necessarily right at the forefront. It certainly used to be. Kids coming in on the street, getting a relatively cheap box of figures and being able to launch into Warhammer hobby. Now it seems to be a little bit more further in from that, because it doesn't offer you literally everything you need to get started. Most of the things you need, but not literally everything. Connected to this is also a couple of questions which came up as part of the same discussion on the painting phase, which is around the two core factors that Games Workshop need to tick off before they will release a new product. One of those is, can we make it our own? Can Games Workshop make it different from everything around them? And let's face it, hills, trees, fences, it's probably difficult to make a Games Workshop tree that is definitely a Games Workshop tree, unless it's a tree made of skulls or something completely ridiculous like that. So if they don't want to be making something which other people in the market will already be making something similar, then it will struggle very much to get over that threshold. And then there's the second question. Will it make sufficient profit? And I believe it was originally stapled along the lines of, will it make £100,000? And I think this kind of depends to a certain extent as to how successful Warhammer the Old World is. If you've got a product that does well and people want to get into, that they want to continue playing, people want to play at home as well as in clubs, etc., there may well be a market for the terrain that you need to effectively play the game. But I think this is where we kind of fall into one of the challenges that Warhammer the Old World faces, in that Games Workshop have said very clearly this isn't a game for new people into wargaming, this is a game for experienced wargamers. So this means people that are more likely to know about the offerings in the wider market. They're more likely, unless they want to play in a Games Workshop store or go to a Games Workshop sanctioned event, they're more likely to want to or be willing to use third-party models, to use 3D prints, etc., rather than just relying on Games Workshop. And all this eats into that, will it make 100,000? Because Games Workshop will charge a premium for their things, they always do. And as much as scenery can be a little bit tricky to get hold of, because stock limits and other stockists, because scales, they may well be providing things for people that want 6mm models, 10mm models, 20mm models, 15mm models, rather than Games Workshop, who, with the exception of Epic and New Epic, work pretty much to a single scale, which is that heroic 28mm / 32mm. Now, it has to be said, I think that a Games Workshop stocking some relatively simple terrain, woods, hills, etc., particularly if it's pre-flocked sort of hills, would carry a massive advantage of convenience. If you can pop in to your local store and just get a piece of terrain, it's far easier than having to order online, wait for it to be delivered, etc. But I'm not sure these opportunistic sales would necessarily, again, be enough to get over that £100,000 mark. From a purely selfish perspective, I think I would like to see Games Workshop releasing some of the old terrain packs. A few items that I could use at home to play some games around would be quite nice. Personally, my terrain set, I've got a couple of buildings and a couple of bits and bobs that could be used for a fancy setting, but actually most of my terrain is for Warhammer 40,000, because that's the game I've been playing most over the last few years. And I would need, I think, to get some more fantasy suitable terrain in order to play. So, but I think, as I say, that's very much a personal thing, and maybe the challenges are too great for Games Workshop. There's definitely challenges to overcome. But if terrain were to come out, it would need to be hand in hand with a successful Old World production. Actually, when I started making this video, I was very much made some notes around the idea of, no, I would like to see Games Workshop bring scenery back. Some basic scenery, just some hills, a couple of marshes, maybe a hill or two, some of the classic buildings, that kind of thing. And this would be a great idea. But I kind of feel like I've talked myself out of my original thought process. The more I've drifted through my notes and speculated around various things. So how would I conclude before I waffle on for absolutely hours? Well, would it be nice to see some terrain pieces suitable for Warhammer the Old World in a Games Workshop store or on the web store? Absolutely yes, particularly if it's in store. Would it be really good if this was basic terrain, hills, etc., that you could just slap out news rather than being some spectacular pile of bones or something which doesn't seem to have a lot of repeat playability. Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see that coming out. Do I think it's likely? Probably not. I think Games Workshop have moved away from those sort of offerings, and perhaps they are too close to the fat end, the product that is too close to the fat end of the hobby cone or hobby trumpet, as opposed to where Games Workshop sit, which is that just that little bit further inside the lip. But tell me, what do you think? Do you want to see some Games Workshop terrain for Warhammer Old World? Do you want to see the basic stuff that I've talked around, or would you rather see the re-release of the Mausoleum kit, for example, and the sort of the fancier elements that we saw in 8th edition? All that remains for me to say, however, is thank you very much for listening to my views on this particular topic. If you've enjoyed it and maybe some of the items in my back catalogue, do consider subscribing. It's the best way of getting a notification of the release of a new video. I am Return to the Old World. Have a great day.